All right, everyone, welcome to the show today. We have an awesome guest with us, James McKendry. He's an exercise researcher and scientist from McMaster University, where just, I'm going to say, probably the most extensive amount of awesome science based information around exercise and nutrition comes out of. I mean, I don't think that there's been university that has more papers published, and not just more papers published, but things of absolute significance. And so I'm excited to have James on today. We're going to be talking a little bit about a study that James was a part of that was just recently published in Exercise, Sport, and Movement. It was a paper entitled The Health Benefits of Resistance Training Beyond Hypertrophy and Big Weights. So, James, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. So why don't, before we get into the paper, I mean, what I would love to hear is just a little bit about your background, your story. I mean, how did you get into this? I mean, I'm assuming that there has been some love around exercise that's at the core of your story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, initially, towards the end of my undergraduate degree, which I completed in the University of Birmingham in the UK, a new faculty member joined the department, and he's a former trainee of Professor Stuart Phillips. So, Dr. Lee Breen offered me this really cool opportunity to do a research study involving stable isotope tracers and muscle biopsies to look at muscle growth where we manipulated rest intervals. So we know amongst the bodybuilding community, at least, that for years, short rest intervals have often been touted as the superior to promote muscle growth. And it was really cool to be a part of a study that actually found essentially the opposite. And the short rest intervals in the really acute phase blunted muscle growth. Of course, that may not translate to the longer term, and we can get into the intricacies of that perhaps at a later date. But that was really my introduction to research, and I really became fascinated behind the things that control muscle growth, whether that's exercise, different types of it, and how you can manipulate that with nutrition. So these are the really kind of key focuses of my research. And then fortunately, I was offered an opportunity to do a postdoctoral research fellowship in Stu Phillips' lab. And there are a few better places to pursue exercise science in the world than under the guidance and mentorship of Stu Phillips. So it was a no-brainer to come over to Canada and pursue that.
That's awesome. So let's get a little bit into this paper that you guys had just recently published. Uh, Talk to us, like, what was the motivation behind this paper?
Yeah, great question. I think the real crux of what made us want to do this was for years and years and years now, the exercise guidelines have often focused on aerobic training to promote health benefits, whether that's reductions in weight or cardiovascular fitness being the ultimate outcome. But we are big proponents of resistance training for health, global health, and is particularly important in certain populations. So, aging individuals can really benefit from this. And we really wanted to highlight the fact that slowly resistance training is being included into these exercise training guidelines. People are understanding the importance of carrying it out just to maintain general health. And it's much more than the typically associated growth of big muscles and getting really strong. There are so many more benefits to it than that.
And we often talk about what those benefits are. And so, I mean, when I viewed this paper, I mean, I viewed this as almost the start of a movement to really start to push resistance training to the forefront, because we've constantly been trying to educate people on the fact that resistance training is king when it comes to any form of exercise. And this should really be the centerpiece of one's exercise programming. And that's pretty much what a lot of this paper was built around, was it not?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We think it should be the focus of a lot of people's exercise training plans. One of the really interesting things is even when you control for cardiovascular fitness, resistance training or muscular strength actually reduces the likelihood of more morbidity and mortality much later in life. So there are so many positive health benefits that can come from exercise training.
Well, and that was it. You touched on several different areas within this paper. I mean, one was mobility. We have cognitive function. There was metabolic health, so related specifically to obesity and type 2 diabetes. Then we had cancer and mortality. And the mortality one, I saw one piece in there that I found really interesting that I definitely want to elaborate on, which was around the amount of time. Um, we ourselves are proponents of very time efficient fitness. So 30-minute resistance training workouts done 2 to 3 times a week at a very high intensity. And I liked that when I was reading this paper, you guys pointed to that 60 to 120-minute window, weekly window, of being almost an optimal amount for improving your mortality. Whereas when it crossed over to 130 to 140 minutes, there was actually negative associations with mortality. So can you expand upon that?
Yeah, I think so. The thing to keep in mind for this is the biggest change in activity or improvements in health outcomes would be going from doing nothing to doing something. So that's where the biggest change comes. And then that increases up to a kind of a point around sort of 60, like you say, to 60 to 120 minutes. But much beyond that, there's almost diminishing returns. You're not going to get any survivorship benefits that extend beyond that window. You're doing enough to make you slightly harder to kill, which is great.
It's always a good thing. So
Yeah.
basically, for those whose reason for exercise is not related to building large muscles or competing as a power lifter or some type of strength sport, or they're an athlete. I mean, if they are sitting in that 60 to 120-minute window, then basically they are in the optimal place to optimize their health and their longevity.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things, of course, like nuanced details. This but the exercise thing that they're right on the money. They're in the sweet spot, that's for sure.
So let's talk then a little bit more about the training recommendations, because unlike a lot of papers, especially that have come out over the past several decades, where we are constantly promoting big, heavy weights for resistance training for the express purpose of muscle hypertrophy, increases in strength. We know that Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's lab, as well as Dr. James Fisher, James Steele, they all have proven at this point that you don't necessarily need the heaviest weights in order to elicit even those responses. But I thought that the fact that you guys honed in on lighter weights was a real interesting piece to this paper.
Yeah, I think that's been say a myth debunking focus of Stu Phillips' lab over the years as well. And I know there are bunch of other labs, like you mentioned, that have kind of really done a good job of hammering this point home. But you can get much of the when it comes to muscle growth anyway, you can get much of the benefits lifting a lighter weight for more sets or reps. Essentially, as long as you're a little bit closer to failure, you're probably I like to think of it like a towel. So you're wringing out most of the benefits anyway. There's probably some tiny little differences with maybe strength development. You might need some of those heavier weights, but when it comes to muscle growth, then as long as you're lifting it with a significant amount of effort, then you're probably going to get most bang for your buck anyway.
So the reason why you guys honed in though throughout this paper on lifting lighter loads and training to or close to momentary muscular failure was that to help present to people this, I guess there's a trepidation on many people's part to engage in resistance training in the first place, right? There's fears built around hurting themselves or maybe not knowing what to do. And so if we lower that bar and say, hey, forget about the weights for a moment, even if you're doing this exercise in a somewhat controlled manner and the weight is light, I mean, just keep going until you can't do anymore. You're going to derive all the benefits that you guys highlighted throughout this paper.
Yeah, definitely. The lighter weight approach certainly reduces one of the barriers that a lot of people will have to performing resistance exercise, particularly with, like you say, populations that may be more hesitant to lift heavier weights, older populations, perhaps newer, less experienced weightlifters who aren't as technically savvy as some others might be, then it totally removes that barrier. And I think it's a great way to get people involved. It also gets your heart rate up there, so that's a good thing too.
Yeah, well, I actually want to dive into that in a moment. We'll come back around to that regarding the aerobic benefits of resistance training because we just recently had Dr. Doug McGuff on our show last week, and he talks a lot throughout his book Body by Science on global metabolic conditioning, and so I definitely want to touch on that with you. But regarding the older populations, another point that you guys highlighted in this was that of mobility and falls. So why don't we touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the really important things to consider is, unfortunately, as you age, as an inevitable consequence, your muscle mass is going to decline and your muscle strength actually declines much faster than you lose muscle mass. But with resistance training as part of your regular routine, you can perhaps delay, offset, or maybe even totally mitigate some of this declines for a significant portion. And the real problem becomes when you've lost so much muscle or so much strength that you drop below a theoretical line of disability and dependency, whereby individuals are no longer able to look after themselves and they rely on external help. And resistance training can go a long way to preserving and delaying you crossing that threshold.
So I'm going to just sort of go off a little bit for a second. We know that especially the elderly population can benefit tremendously from resistance training, and I think that what this highlighted is the approach that most in that community would take is that of, hey, I'm just going to go for a walk, hey, I'm going to play some tennis or some golf, and that's really, while it's great to stay mobile, it's not ultimately going to do much when it comes to preventing or protecting against some of these things that could happen as we are losing muscle tissue, especially the falls, which we know we've all heard of or know of some elderly person who fell and broke their hip, and then suddenly their health just declined significantly from that point forward, very likely due to the not being mobile anymore, and all the factors related. But what do you see as a potential solution in for this community of people so that we can get them more involved in strength training?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think you hit the nail on the head. They're trying to further reduce barriers to exercise for these individuals is so important. Uh, Once you've lost the ability to get out of the strength to get out of a chair and things, then you just rely on other people. So some solutions that we're looking at within our lab actually are delivering kind of online Zoom workouts, whereby we can give people the tools or something as simple as a resistance band workout. And we know with lighter weights, doing these things at home may be able to increase. And it's a simple form of resistance exercise that anyone can do, and it may be able to help these older individuals and keep them active within their communities, keep them mobile. You are totally correct. By lowering the bar too much, a walk is not going to build you muscle or get you strong. I'd never discourage anyone from playing tennis or to go for a walk, but that needs to be included as well as some form of resistance training, I think.
Yeah, and I totally agree that we need to lower the barrier to entry. I mean, that is the biggest problem. And, especially with that community of people, you once again are talking even greater fear around hurting themselves or doing something that, takes them out of the game. I have two parents, both in their 70s, and they spend a portion of their time down in South Carolina because they love to golf. And while down there, I mean, they follow our online program. My mother is consistently at least 2 times a week with, with her weights and doing body weight work. And she noted also what a significant difference it's made in her bone density and just, overall ability to carry out those things that you want to do for recreation. Those things like playing golf or tennis or pickleball, whatever it is that you enjoy to do. This really needs to be a staple and treated as though we are brushing our teeth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. For me personally, resistance training's a non-negotiable. I might perform slightly fewer sessions than a few other people, so I'm in the 4, maybe 5 if I'm feeling particularly active that week. But comparing it to brushing your teeth as a getting some form of daily strengthening activity, as long as you're meeting the 2 times per week, I think you're going to be getting the most benefit. But you may be able to wring out a few more extra benefits from that towel I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. That's why I feel that, for our community in particular, where we are dealing with a lot of individuals who are extremely busy, where time is often the biggest barrier because of family obligations, work obligations. Listen, if I could take it back to when I was in college and could train 4, 5, even 6 days a week, in retrospect, I realized that I probably wasn't getting much more beyond those first, 3 or 4 days. But it's should be very encouraging to anyone out there listening that with just as little as 2 workouts a week, as long as your intensity level is high enough that you are going to wring out that towel. And many times when we look at this from a cost benefit ratio, even if you were to try to wring out that towel even further, how much more will that benefit you when it starts to then interfere with those other areas of your life? And, I hate to be the guy who tells everyone, hey, just accept where you're at, because I feel like there's always a workaround, right? Even if it's not that you can add in the extra sessions per week, there's always some workaround, whether that is you're working with a trainer who can push you to a higher intensity level than you would yourself, or you're adding in intensity variables, or just simply uh, having periods of time where, hey, because you have a week off from work, you can do a little bit extra that week and increase your overall demands before you scale back. I mean, there's multiple ways to go about this. And, I'm only highlighting this because I do feel that people get caught in this place where they feel everything has to be static. It has to be the same all the time. And if they can't do it exactly like that all the time, that they're not getting the full benefit from the thing that they're doing. And the last thing we want is to see people drop off because they feel like, oh, I can't keep up with those demands, or I can't keep up with that schedule. And that's what I really love about what you guys are doing over there, and what you're pointing to as far as like a minimal effective dose when it comes to exercise.
Yeah, I think a really nice way to think about it is if, say, you had your savings account and you lost 10% of you wouldn't throw the other 90% out with it. By missing one session, not the end of the world. Please just get back on the horse and keep going.
Absolutely. All right, cool. So let's dive into a few of the other things. I'm going to kind of work my way backwards here. What about cancer? That's obviously a very serious issue for a lot of people. We know many people personally who've been dealing with, currently dealing with it. So talk to me about what you guys found out with regards to resistance training and cancer.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area. And of course, we know cancer is one of the leading causes of death worldwide, regardless of whatever the country that you were born in. But physical activity for people with cancer, actually, it's not going to stop you getting it. Let me say that. That seems to be that's a natural occurrence anyway. But what it can do is improve your likelihood of improve your muscle mass, your survivorship, reduce your morbidity, protect you against those sensations of fatigue, so that you can go about your day a little bit better whilst you're undergoing treatment. And by increasing your muscle mass, perhaps you've got a greater reservoir for some of those nasty toxins to go. You have a better resistance against some of the chemotoxicity things. Just some of the small benefits. And of course, it can reduce your likelihood of early mortality with some of these diseases. So, yeah, it's really, really good for overall health and cancer survivorship.
And though nobody ever wants to, think about it, God forbid you find yourself in that situation where you've been diagnosed with cancer, it just points to the importance of keeping resistance training at the forefront of what you do, even when you seem to be in what would be considered by most good health. Because we can look at it, I've described it before, it's like an insurance policy. You want to have enough muscle where if you lost some, it's not going to create havoc. It's not going to wreak havoc on your body. I mean, you're already ahead of the game. And I think that's too, when you point to the elderly, I think that is probably the thing that many people in there, you're not thinking about it in your 20s. You're maybe thinking about it a little bit in your 30s, but when you get into your 40s and 50s, now this is where you need to keep your foot on the gas with respect to having resistance training as part of your weekly regimen. Because listen, after the age of 30, people naturally are going to lose anywhere from 3 to 8% of their muscle mass, right? Sarcopenia hits like a bastard. And so, and suddenly all the things that you found to be easy once before are a struggle, and it has less to do with aging and probably more to do with loss of muscle. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can speak from my situation. I'm just over the 30 hump, so I'm 32. My plan for the next 8 years before I get to 40 is to get as big and strong and fit as I possibly can before I start to slide down that age-related decline. But it's a really interesting area of research, the prehabilitation. So essentially, I'm starting mine really early, but there are situations and some good researchers doing some cool stuff focused on almost training for illness. So, say you have an elective surgery, a cancer removal that's coming up, whether you can implement a resistance training program that will be effective in the run up to that surgery, such that your outcomes are better when you're trying to recover, which I think is fascinating, and I certainly would do it. So, I mean, I wouldn't wish cancer upon my worst enemy, but I think it's a really cool thing to do, training for these periods of disuse, which we know are so debilitating, particularly for older people.
And we've seen it, in our studios where we've had people prior to surgeries coming in, and this is now going back even 8, 10 years. Thankfully, they had the right surgeon. They were working with the right doctor who had recommended, hey, before you come in and do this, you know, go and do as much as you can to strengthen your body, to strengthen your muscles, especially those who are coming in for knee surgery, or not coming into us for knee surgeries, but we're going to go in for knee surgeries or shoulder surgeries, and coming in with that prehab framework, I think is so smart. You only hope that more and more surgeons and orthopedists and such, would start to recommend this as just their prescription for people versus just the surgery itself.
Definitely. The muscle mass loss, like you say, with aging is pretty much it's like 0.5% to 1% a year ish. So 3 to 8% per decade is a pretty good number, but you can lose with a single bout of bed rest or limb immobilization from a cast. So you have a broken leg or after a surgery, you can lose 4 to 8% in kind of a 2 week period, and it drops off so fast. And without intervention or resistance training on the tail end of that, then particularly if you're an older person, you never really get it back. And it's a horrible decline of loss and never getting it back, loss, never getting it back. And it means you cross that threshold of disability much earlier than you perhaps would have expected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my own personal story about the way in which resistance training was both the cause of an issue as well as the solution. And mine goes all the way back to those years between 13 and 22, where there was a lot of heavy yet biomechanically incorrect training, not enough focus in the right areas. I mean, specifically, I had developed sciatica at 19, playing college lacrosse. I remember we go on our spring trip, and one morning we go out to practice, and I was pretty decent at cutting hard and dodging. And I remember going to cut and just feeling my legs collapse underneath me, and it never got better from that point forward, and had to go see the trainer, and the athletic trainer pointed out, you have sciatica. I was like, what? And then he starts to explain, how I had just this tremendous tightness in my hamstrings, and all the pressure it was putting on my vertebrae and on the nerves. And it took those 4 years to just get a little bit better, but it wasn't until I left college and came across a trainer who asked me just point blank, do you ever train your low back? And like a lot of people who have low back problems, the answer is, oh no, I don't want to hurt myself, And he's like, absolutely not, unacceptable. Get in the low back extension machine. And he started helping me to rehab my back. And I remember it took only 3 months of properly executed low back exercises for it to be almost completely remedied. And then over the next 8 years, I continued that myself. And at this time now, it's been probably, I'm going to say 12 years since I've experienced a twinge in my low back. And that's obviously also eliminating any exercises that would cause that issue in the first place. But I'm just want to point out to people that, the things that you might be avoiding because your fear of exacerbating the problem, you're probably taking the wrong approach to this. Yes, there's always cause for concern. There's always cause to be smart or err on the side of caution, but complete avoidance is probably the worst thing that you could do.
Yeah, I must say I'm also guilty of lifting legs heavy, no lower back work, minimal core work when I was at school, and I slipped a disc in my back pretty early on, and it's never really the same again. So without significant improvements in my approach to things, I'd still be experiencing those issues. Deadlifts were not my friend in school, but now I think it's a case, like you say, just highlight those weaknesses, fix the weaknesses. Like, don't avoid exercise altogether. It's so good for you, but you just need to go about it in a slightly smarter manner, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, there's always a workaround, and whether that means for some people, if knees are an issue, then yeah, maybe you can't do leg extensions or lunges, but there's nothing to say that you can't do static work, and that you're still getting a tremendous amount of benefit from doing static contractions. And I think these are the things that people lose sight of, is that there is always a workaround if you dig deep enough, or at least you work with somebody who knows enough to figure what these things are.
I would say it's very difficult to build muscle. It requires some pretty concerted effort, but it requires a much lower dose to keep hold of what you've got. So you don't need to, you can do a little bit here and there, and you'll keep hold of most of it for a pretty long time, but building it requires a bit more effort.
Well, and that's why I really honor the approach that you're taking at 32, using these next 8 years as this run up to build that reservoir. And then knowing that, okay, once I cross that threshold, or once I've maxed out, I don't need to keep working at the same capacity in order to maintain what I have. And I think that should be really encouraging to a lot of people, because there's a lot of us who can take a short period of time and say, okay, you know what, for this period of time, 8 years may be considered a long period of time, but again, in total years, it's nothing. But we can focus on a goal for a very short period of time and put maximum effort, maximum focus into it. But then to know that from that point forward, you do not necessarily need to keep working at that capacity. in order to maintain it is really encouraging, because I feel like that is the one thing that most absolutely prevents people from starting in the first place. They get overwhelmed by the idea that I'm going to require X amount, but I know I'm not going to be able to keep up with X amount forever. And so why even bother?
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that's why, in this, what I think what you guys pointed to also is that right now, the general recommendation for exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, is 150 minutes a week. And a lot of people feel that for them that might be exceeding what they can do, and so they prefer just either not to exercise, or they just do that little bit, but again, not enough to really make an impact. Whereas if the focus of even 60 minutes a week was resistance training, I mean, you can derive all of those aerobic benefits from the resistance training, correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, particularly with. There's a nice figure in the paper that you've been talking about that shows the adaptations that are specific to resistance training, aerobic training, and then the ones that overlap. And there's so much overlap, particularly with this approach, like a low load training. You get the metabolic health benefits, the improvement in body composition, mobility, mitochondrial improvements, cognitive function. There's so much overlap. Really, the only ones that don't improve drastically with resistance training are the cardiorespiratory things that come with typical aerobic training. You'll get some, particularly if you're doing like high intensity resistance training, like a circuit kind of workout or CrossFit style. You'll get some, but some of those benefits can really there's probably a lot more left in that towel to be wrung out by doing some aerobic training.
Well, if I can challenge that for a second, what about though, with a lot of the ways that we test for our cardiovascular conditioning, isn't so much of that though specific to the exercise that you're doing? Meaning, again, I talked about this with Dr. Doug McGuff. Um, you know, if you are somebody who is a runner, and now we're going to do your VO2 max, and we're going to test it, and we're going to have you do it while you're running on a treadmill, which you do all the time anyway, you're going to test better than if we turned around and said, you know what, we're going to test you on a bike and do this. And even though somebody can be really good at running, metabolically, they're not necessarily set up to do as well on the bike.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's not a whole lot of transfer from one method of testing aerobic capacity to the other. And I think if you were truly to test people, you probably get a slightly higher score for a VO2 max on a treadmill than you would on a bike. But I think still you'd get more cardiorespiratory benefits from exercise aerobic training than you would resistance training. But I think you can get a good chunk of it done, particularly with high intensity approach. I mean, if you're a power lifter and you go up, you do that 3 to 5 sets for 3 to 5 exercises, 3 to 5 times a week kind of approach. That's probably not going to do a whole lot for your ability to run or cycle. But I'd probably sit somewhere between my first comment and what you said as well. There's definitely not as good a transfer from something. So thanks.
Well, you know what though? I think you bring up though an excellent point there in using the power lifter as the example, because what we're not taking what we're taking some of this out of context, in that we have to be very mindful of the way somebody is actually training. And I am a little guilty of really being far to the resistance training side of things without a need for aerobic exercise, simply because most of our training takes place in a studio setting. There's no interference. The sets are typically in excess of 45 seconds to maxing out at maybe 110 seconds. And when you're working at that higher intensity for that period of time, you are definitely deriving a lot more of an aerobic benefit from this than that person who is just simply going in, doing a few reps. They're never testing their cardiovascular or their metabolic system that hard. And so they're not going to experience all the, all the overflow of benefits that you would get from training at a higher intensity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's definitely intensity, duration, exercise type specific for sure.
Yeah, I love that, when we do look at this, a lot of times we try to though separate out completely the aerobic system from the anaerobic system without realization that you really can't separate those two exclusively. I mean, if you are working anaerobically, like truly to your threshold, um, because of the lactic acid that's going to be built up and then going to get converted into pyruvate, and then in order for your body to process that pyruvate, it has to use the aerobic energy system to do that. And what winds up happening, if you're training at a high enough intensity level, well, you get a lot of the aerobic benefit on the back end of your training, not necessarily while you're doing that very intense anaerobic exercise, but rather when you are finished and you go on with the rest of your day, you can, from an energetic perspective, still be working that aerobic system just to clear out all that built up waste, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very true. Good point.
I'm just gonna push as hard as I can to not have to do any type of cardio. So that's
That's good. So, yeah, I come from a pretty similar stance as well. If I can avoid it, then I definitely will.
but you know what it is? It's not just even avoidance. Once again, it's more so that people begin to realize that, hey, if you are limited, and this is what I just loved about this paper. Like, if you are limited, you guys pointed out that resistance training and aerobic training together will probably provide the highest benefit. But if you have to choose one, if you're literally your health dependent upon it, then you should be choosing resistance training every time and making that centerpiece.
Yeah, I know I would, or I do.
Cool. So why don't we talk just a little bit more about the we didn't get into yet the metabolic health benefits. So can you talk about on obesity, type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know similar with cancer is rife, but obesity and type 2 diabetes are one of the biggest challenges to the Western world with the plethora of highly processed, ultra processed foods available to people. It's a real big problem with reduced activity levels. So, what resistance exercise training offers is an opportunity to increase the muscle mass that you do have, increase the sensitivity of that muscle to the fuels such that it clears the system out of them circulating. Um, and it can offer, of course, the usual benefits of increasing increasing muscle mass and decreasing fat mass at the same time. So like a recomposition, which lends itself to improved metabolic health, lower blood sugar, improved insulin sensitivity. And these are really important health markers for the population.
And this is not something that is limited to one's age, correct? I mean, you could be a 56-year-old woman, never weight trained before, suffering from obesity. Maybe you are type 2 diabetic at this point or pre-diabetic, and implementing this right away can make a significant impact.
Yeah, the improvements in body composition and the increase in the sensitivity of skeletal muscle to some of those fuels can have stark benefits for overweight, obese individuals, irrespective of age.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up processed foods, because that is probably the biggest uh, the biggest obstacle for people right now is we eat according to convenience, and unfortunately, the things that typically are most convenient are the things that are most harmful to our health and have the biggest negative impact on us. But to me, the light at the end of the tunnel is, hey, even in the face of that, by implementing resistance training on a more regular basis, you can start to offset some of that. And then obviously you need to address the nutrition itself. But I think that oftentimes I'm guilty of downplaying the role of exercise because I, come from that mentality that, hey, if it's fat loss is the problem, then, that's going to be fixed almost entirely through your nutrition, which I believe there's probably 90% truth to, but probably that other 10% of truth is that resistance training would be the thing that kind of takes it over the top.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big debate amongst exercise scientists for whether you can outrun or out exercise a bad diet. I don't want to tell you where I sit on that. I think it's different. It's mostly an energy expenditure thing. It's that energy balance, but I think the problem with the overnutrition and the importance of exercise to it offers benefits irrespective of poor nutrition. So you're still going to get benefits from performing the exercise. I guess that's the important point to hammer home.
So I mean, I do want to know where
Yeah.
do you stand on it?
I think for me, I think it's possible, but when people think about outrunning a bad diet, what they think is, oh, you're eating 1,500 calories over maintenance, and then you go on a 5 kilometer run, the energy expenditure to intake really doesn't match up. I think you could quite easily, it would be a much different story if you were to run a marathon and eat 1,500 calories over maintenance. I think it's just a mismatch for me in the energy intake versus out. And people are really notoriously bad at estimating both. Underplay the amount they take in, overplay the amount they expend.
Yeah, when you start seeing some of the statistics on that, most people are off by anywhere from 20 to 50% with regards to how much they think they're taking in. And, I think it's a good point to make too that your food choices play a major role in that because if we are eating these highly processed foods, more of those calories are absorbed compared to its natural form. And I remember seeing a study that compared eating peanuts to peanut butter. And they showed that the subjects that ate the peanuts absorbed about 80% of the calories from the peanuts versus the group who ate peanut butter, they absorbed 100% of the calories. And it just goes to show that little uptick in processing makes a big difference. And that also lends to the issues that we have with trying to estimate how much we're taking in. Because if you're eating a 100% whole food diet, then you might not be absorbing all, say, 2,000 calories. You might only be absorbing 1,500 of those calories. Whereas, if you're eating 2,000 calories on a Twinkie diet, chances are you are absorbing all 2,000 calories plus creating all the metabolic issues that are going to cause you to store even more calories thereafter.
Yeah, I don't know how many Twinkies a 2,000 calorie diet uh, is, but I don't think I'd survive very long on that.
Yeah, absolutely not. Actually, unfortunately, I don't think it takes too many Twinkies to get to 2,000 calories.
That is so concerning.
Excellent. All right, so why don't we just touch lastly, and this has been one of my favorite things to touch on with people with regards to resistance exercise is the cognitive benefits. I mean, this is something that, when people think about doing exercise, they think a lot about just going to clear their mind, but this goes so far beyond just clearing your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. This kind of lines up nicely with lots of the things we've been discussing about the aging. So typically with older individuals from beyond a certain age, you start to experience some form of cognitive decline. Your decision making becomes a bit more difficult. You start to forget things, those kinds of things. And it seems to be that there are cognitive benefits such that these large executive functions of the brain, so focus, attention, decision planning, decision making, and planning, those kinds of things can be significantly improved with performing resistance training. Now, the mechanism is still a little uncertain, but it seems to be attributed to this brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is, put simply, I guess, a protein responsible for maintaining and stimulating new neuronal growth and gray matter in the brain. So I think that's what it's doing. That seems to be where people are pointing the finger or the blame for it. But yeah, the cognitive benefits of performing resistance exercise go far beyond just clearing your head, which is great news.
Yeah, this, ties in so nicely to conversations we've been having a lot on the podcast lately about myokines and, that our muscles, I mean, as much as we like to say that the skin is the largest organ, when we really think about it, it's really the muscles. And that muscle, though, is what's releasing so many of these chemical messengers and hormones and things like BDNF that are showing us all these tremendous benefits. And it's just absolutely mind-boggling to me when you really start to dig into the research on myokines, where you see the effect of exercise in general. As I've discussed recently with some people, I'm more excited to see when they start to really separate it out and compare those effects from resistance training to aerobic training to interval training, and start to see which has the most impact. I mean, we're probably still a decade away from that research, but it's very promising.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those studies, of course, would require pretty large sample sizes to be able to tease out the differences between those effects. But I think the really important point is there are localized benefits from resistance exercise or exercise in general. There can be muscle growth, increased capillaries, all these local benefits, but the systemic benefits that exercise offers as well from circulating factors are enormous.
And I think when you take the research on myokines, which is researching it amongst various types of exercise, but then you take a study like what you guys have done here, you take this paper that's comparing the effects of resistance training to aerobic training and showing that there's tremendously more benefit from the resistance training side, that to me, it makes it kind of a no-brainer that it's showing that this really truly is the king of all exercises. And my hope for everybody listening is that they really latch on to that and take it seriously. And if you know there's a plethora of information today, and so much access that we have to various ways to learn how to train properly. And I know that it can be confusing, and that there's oftentimes very contradictory information. So it may require a little bit of digging. But the point is that it's there. And once you learn a lot of this stuff, you can't unlearn it. That's why I like having people like you on, James, because once people hear this, it's like you can't unhear it. And now that I mean, at this point, then it just becomes a decision. Are you going to do this to benefit your life, today, as well as maybe 10, 20, 30, possibly 50 years from now, or are you going to ignore it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's never too late to start. So the sooner you do, the better the better your outcomes, I guess, regardless of the metric you use to measure it, whether it's mobility or metabolic health. The sooner you're going to start, the better.
Well, listen, James, this has been absolutely awesome. Is there anything else that you want to add? Anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to discuss?
No, I think we covered everything. So I think the really key points to take home for people are like the benefits of exercise might be a little bit different between resistance and aerobic training, but there's a lot of overlap. You can get many of the same benefits, and we're slowly starting to see a move of guidelines to incorporate the strength training because people are starting to appreciate that they should be absolutely central to people's exercise regimens. and long may that continue, I guess.
I definitely second that and appreciate you being on here with us today, James. This was awesome and look forward to having you back sometime.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Mike. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.